Is loneliness really as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day?
All right. So most people have probably heard this, right? This is like a well used and worn factoid. The purpose or like the origin of this fact is looking at mortality data. So looking at the likelihood of death, period, by any cause. And the truth is that yes, being isolated is associated with a significantly higher chance of dying by any cause. And that doesn't mean that like you're more likely to get in a car accident, not that, but that if you just track mortality, the likelihood of death, period, isolated people are more likely to die. And we'll get to that in a second. I do want to clarify that, of course, smoking 15 cigarettes will have different health effects on your body than being isolated. Being isolated doesn't necessarily affect your lungs specifically, whereas cigarettes will. Anyways, so the broader question here then is like, why? Why is being isolated so bad for you? And there's a couple of different answers, but the shortest answer that I like to give that makes a lot of sense is that being isolated is a form of stress for the body, and the body treats it that way. Being when you're isolated, there's it triggers the stress response, the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and drives cortisol release, and all the other related stress response systems are turned on, and that's because being alone is evolutionarily unfavorable. If you think about hundreds of thousands of years ago, we're existing in tribes in the woods or wherever, and you're being hunted by an animal, you're way more likely to survive an attack if you're in a group. You're much more likely to be successful at hunting down an animal and feeding yourself if you're in a group. So being alone is bad. Being alone is a signal to your brain that the likelihood of you dying just went up. And so your brain wants to have some sort of system to motivate you to get back with your tribe. And that's why, presumably, isolation triggers a stress response. And interestingly, we actually see the opposite in solitary animals. So in animals that are, they're better at existing on their own, like a lion, or I'm sorry, not a lion, a tiger. Tigers are really good at hunting by themselves. They don't really need to be in packs. And so they show the opposite wiring. So when they're with other animals, with other tigers, they show a rise in cortisol. And when they're by themselves, they show a decrease in cortisol. So it's a good example of how the demands of our lifestyle shape our neurobiology. So that stress response, if you have this elevated cortisol for a long time, what can happen is basically short-term stress is good for you in some ways in that it kind of prepares your body to defend yourself, to take on whatever challenge is coming your way. And one of the things that involves is reducing inflammation. Because if you're being chased by a tiger, you want to have less inflammation so you can be most effective at defending yourself. But if stress is long-term and that cortisol remains elevated for an extended period, what can happen is your body desensitizes to that. And so when you're stressed, you no longer show that anti-inflammatory response. And so that's why chronic stress is associated with chronic inflammation, and that's just bad for you. Having inflammation all through your tissues and your brain, your heart, your lungs, your organs, it's bad for those organs and their function. It gets in the way. And so I believe that what's happening that's making isolation as deadly as 15 cigarettes a day is that it's basically causing dysfunction in our organs, and that increases the risk of things like a heart attack. It makes us more vulnerable to all sorts of insults that might happen naturally to the brain. If you may be more likely to have a stroke. You may be more likely to develop dementia. As these things happen, your brain is not as equipped to defend itself, and so you may have a poorer stroke recovery that results in a higher likelihood of death. If you suffer a heart attack, there may be undue inflammation in your heart that triggers, or it makes you more likely to not survive the heart attack. So I think, that's probably one of the reasons why, but there's also more to why isolation is bad for us.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a very indirect mechanism, right? Just similar to when you hear people say, journaling will help you be healthier from a physical fitness component and from like a trauma perspective. And it's not just like when you're writing words down, like it's like you're burning body fat. It's like if you are not processing your emotions, you're probably going to eat junk food and your sleep's going to be off, therefore making it harder for you to lose weight. I think the other part that I think people probably want to know is like what constitutes loneliness? Because there's certain people who just like peace and quiet, being alone. Like how do you, from a science perspective, like how do you begin to unpack what it actually means to be lonely or to not be lonely?
Great question. So it's important to note the distinction between loneliness and isolation. Those two things are different. They're often used interchangeably, but loneliness is the state of being lonely, of feeling lonely. It's an emotion, right? You can be at a concert with 20,000 people in a stadium, but you can attend the concert by yourself. And despite being surrounded by all these people, you can feel lonely. Or you can sit in a coffee shop working with people around you, but you're lonely because you're alone. Isolation, on the other hand, is the objective state of being by yourself. And so, like right now, I am in this room alone. Technically, you're here with me, but I'm virtual. But if I close my laptop right now, I would be isolated. I am by myself. But I don't feel lonely because we're here on this call having this talk right now, right? So as far as now defining like what's the sort of threshold of like when are you too lonely, right? Because everyone does have different social dispositions. So what the research suggests is that trait extroversion, so how extroverted you are, is a really significant mediator of that question of like how much interaction should you get? When is loneliness dangerous? So I like to think of an analogy like you, Doug, or the listener. So imagine that you have a cup and that cup represents your social diet. I like to use the term social diet for what social interactions we're taking in, how much we're getting. So when you get social interactions, that cup fills up. And for some people, the cup fills up really, really fast. So you might go out for an hour and you might hit the top of the cup and be like, I'm good. I'm ready to go home. For other people, like myself, I'm very extroverted. I go out for an hour and I'm like just warming up. My cup is like 10% full, And so one really important thing to know is that, yes, connecting with others is good and isolation is bad, but that doesn't mean that everybody should just be like saturating themselves in social interaction, never having time to themselves. Because once that cup goes overfilled, which you can feel, you can kind of experience that as like, yeah, I'm good. I'm all socialed up. People say my social battery is dead, right? That's really pretty much where that is. At that point, you are welcome to withdraw and take yourself into a state of isolation or whatever you really want at that time. You've hit that level. And for everybody, that's different. Some people it might take a lot. Some people it might take little. But then the other side of that is this cup drains progressively for everyone. For a super extrovert who needs a lot of interaction to feel their best, the cup may completely deplete within a day. So for me, I'm alone for a day. By the end of the day, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to like call somebody. It's too much. But for an introvert, a day later, you might still be close to the top. It's like, no thanks. So I think what's important is to recognize when have you hit the bottom? When is your cup fully empty? Because the longer your cup stays empty, that's when you're starting to get into those negative consequences. So it's not always bad to be alone. If you've had recent social interactions and you're feeling satiated or, kind of satisfied with your interactions, then you're fine. But you can also kind of sense that cup empty feeling. It's a little bit harder because, it's really easy when you're in interaction. It's like, this is enough. But it's harder to sense when you're too isolated because I think for a lot of people, we tend to not think about the social part. We start to feel a little off. Maybe our emotions are a little flattened. We might feel some stress. We might feel a little bit more irritable. Maybe we feel less motivated to like get out and do things. We don't feel as interested in connecting with others. It's just sort of like, you could start to feel anxious, depressed, all sorts of things. But in those times, you're probably thinking, maybe it's that, junk food I had for lunch, or maybe it's the fact that I've been sitting on my computer working all day. Most people don't think it's because I haven't seen a friend in a while. And I think that's where we can really do better is by recognizing, maybe try supplementing with more friendships and more connection, because it could have really surprising benefits on your mood and overall health.
I know you talked about it from like a neurobiological perspective where, being lonely relates more to like being more stress and inflammation and your ability to kind of like survive, right, in today's world. I'm wondering, like, is the reason that it has an impact on mortality because it impacts like mental health specifically, like from a self-esteem standpoint? People have equated being alone with being like a failure or a loser or just having like low self-confidence. Do you think that there's a relationship between those two things as well as to why like loneliness has such a poor impact on our brains?
So not necessarily in the way you've described, but I think there's definitely a relationship between interaction and mood. Like, so people feel better after interacting. But why do we feel worse after not interacting, right? I think some of that is like the absence of the interaction. But also, I said in the beginning, like one way to answer your question is this inflammation, and chronic stress angle. But there's another angle as well, that there are other changes in how the brain functions when someone is lonely. And what that often entails is changes in basically how people perceive social interactions. They tend to feel, like I said, less motivated to interact. They experience less social reward. They experience less trust of others. And so, like, this is kind of parallel in my mind to what you were asking, in that you kind of you can dig yourself into a deeper trench once you're already isolated, that you start to think, I don't know if I even want to see my friends. I'm not sure if that's really what's good for me. I'm not sure if maybe I'm going to be rejected. You can maybe feel a little bit more anxious. And that's also super dangerous. I guess maybe dangerous is an extreme word for it, but it's just unhelpful, to be direct, and so, if you are isolated, if you have, even it's been a couple of days, you haven't had a good interaction, you're working from home, whatever it is. Maybe you just had your tonsils out and you're at home in bed all day for a week and you're feeling like a little bit disconnected from your relationships. Recognize that this is like neuroscientifically documented in your brain, that the way your brain reacts to social information can change. And so the more you take yourself out of that isolation and take on social interactions, you may find that it doesn't necessarily sort of hit the same initially, but with a couple experiences, you'll probably find that you get relief from that that different perspective that isolation can bring on.
Going more into like what's going on right now, like you and I are connected virtually. We met virtually through social media. And I think a lot of people, they have the opportunity to be connected online. And yet I feel like as connectivity online has increased, so has loneliness. Why do people continue to feel so lonely despite, quote unquote, having the ability to be so connected online?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. Like, how wild is it that, if you went back like 500 years and talked to a distant relative of yours and explained social media, and that you can connect with anybody, anywhere, anytime. We all, like, the amount of time people spend online, it's wild. Like 6.5% of global attention is contributed or is put into social media. That means like it's like 63% of the world's population uses social media, and they use it for about 10% of all their time that they get in life. Pretty wild. Despite the fact that we're all so connected, there's more bickering and there's more loneliness and there's all these social problems. And I definitely believe that virtual interactions are not nearly equivalent to in-person interactions. And the research supports that generally people don't feel as good after interacting online. The less lifelike an interaction is, the less benefit people get from it in terms of mood. So like a text conversation is less lifelike than a video conversation, which is less lifelike than face-to-face interaction. But the other thing too is, like, I actually published a theory on this. I call it the virtual disengagement hypothesis, meaning in virtual environments, the brain areas that contribute to empathy, I believe that they are disengaging. And I think that it's actually affecting the way we perceive others online, which might be why we're so hostile and why there's so much anger and aggression online, is because our brains are trained through hundreds of thousands or millions of years of evolution to detect social cues through facial expressions and vocal tone and body language and all these signals that we give each other. And that's the brain signal that you are interacting with another person. And that's also your brain's signal to say, okay, what is this person's information telling me about how they're feeling? Their facial expression is telling me, oh, they're happy, they're sad. And so you can understand people better. But online, we don't have any of those cues. And there is some preliminary evidence that basically the context of social media may reduce the activity of those areas, those brain areas, but it hasn't been tested directly. So I really think that that's a big contributor, that, even though we may technically be connected with others, we're really not connecting in a way that our brains are designed for.
And so, how can we navigate this better so that we're not over indexing for social media connection and we're prioritizing in person stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's as simple as it sounds, like put away the phones and get back to connecting in person. I don't really know what life is like for a young person, a teenager nowadays. But I would imagine that, and I've heard that social media and like virtual interactions take up a lot of social real estate. And I think that's a big problem, especially because in the early years of life, we're really learning about how the world behaves. We're learning about how others feel. We're developing empathy and other social, skills through our experiences. And so if a lot of those experiences are coming through digital, you know, compressed versions, I'm not sure that we're getting the same training that helps us shape our social models of the world. And, we identify basically like how to not violate others' boundaries and human rights. So, you know, I think, like I said, it's as simple as it sounds. I mean, if you have the opportunity to connect with someone face to face, I mean, this happens all the time. Just recently I had a colleague reach out and say, hey, are you available for a phone call? And this guy happens to live in the same city as me. I was like, just come over. Let's have a coffee at my house. Like so much better, such a better interaction. And I think what we can't fall prey to is the allure of convenience. That's really what it comes down to, is like everything's so much more convenient when it's online. You can work from home, you could order groceries online, you could pretty much do anything online. You can go to the doctor through telemedicine online. Nowadays, you can even omit another facial interaction or social interaction by ordering a taxi that's actually just a car that drives itself. You don't have to talk to the taxi driver. We have so many new ways of removing social interactions from our life by sort of automating them. And so I think while they may be convenient, if it's equally convenient for you in a situation to go either route, to go to the doctor's office instead of sitting at home, or to just go to the grocery store and talk to the cashier and talk to the person behind the butcher's counter or whatever, instead of ordering groceries at home, if it's not a difference to you, you should choose the social route, because I think we're getting used to that so much that we're actually losing sight of how life used to be. And so, I have this whole argument at the beginning of my book, Why Brains Need Friends, where I talk about how our predictions have shifted, in that 10 years ago, our brains expected some level of interaction. We expected that when we call our bank, a human being's going to answer. When we pull up, maybe this predates 10 years ago, but when we pull up to the bank, it's not an automated teller service, ATM, it's a actual human, and then we had COVID, we had a bunch of shifts in all these different social domains, like I described, that stripped us of daily, ordinary interactions, where now we're getting much less interaction than we used to. The data is showing that. But I think the problem is that our predictions have updated. So our brain is constantly making predictions about the world and what we should expect. And when those predictions are violated, that's when we pay the most attention. When you go to take a step and the step isn't there, your brain's like, whoa, pay attention right there. And so in COVID, when we weren't interacting, our brains were paying super close attention. We felt super isolated and pent up and uncomfortable because our predictions were being violated. But then we spent, 2 years in that stew of isolation. And then now our brains, I believe our predictions have downshifted. And so I think just because we're not expecting as much interaction doesn't mean that our brains don't need as much interaction. And so I think we need to make a conscious effort to try to supplement and surprise our brains with more interaction than it expects, until we sort of shift back to that preset standard of like what we used to experience, how we used to experience life in our social lives.
And you're getting at the point of like neuroplasticity, right? And how our brains have changed and can be conditioned to feel a certain way. And that kind of gets into where I wanted to go next. It's like, everybody knows the more obvious signs, I should say, of loneliness, where you're having severe mental health issues, you're like clinically depressed, you're, potentially, thinking certain thoughts about yourself. But I think there's a lot that just goes unnoticed, right? Because people get into routines kind of like you've just described. Like, what are some of the hidden signs that somebody might actually be experiencing loneliness, even when they're not like externally displaying the traditional symptoms of somebody who is feeling super lost?
Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, loneliness is associated with higher rates of anxiety and depression, all these clinical terms, right? But that doesn't mean that loneliness, the sign you're going to experience is anxiety or depression. It means that people who are lonely tend to get noticed by medical professionals and classified into those things, right? So what's the sort of actual like rising tide of loneliness that leads people in that direction? I think it's helpful to think of it this way. Imagine that right now, just snap my fingers and every other human on Earth disappeared. You are completely by yourself on Earth. There's no music to listen to from musical artists. There's no radio. There's no humans around. You work in an empty office. You sit by yourself at dinner. This goes on and on and on for days and weeks and years. That, for most people, I think, will trigger a response that feels like stress. For me, it feels scary. It feels alarming. I feel like my chest is tightening up. And if you can sort of harness and step into that emotion of how that feels, that's kind of what you pretty much should be looking for, right? Like, are you feeling a sense of just general unease, right? And anxiety and this like tightness in your chest? It depends on how you experience anxiety and stress, really. But, the like I said in the beginning, the fact that this isolation stress response is triggered by our brain's desire to not die, basically. I think if you experience a sense of like disconnection from your community and being like cast out and alone, and the stress that comes with that, that's a good sort of hint to look at in yourself. And that's also, by the way, why I think it's really dangerous that we have such intense political polarization right now in America, because I think when that's happening and you're opening the news every day and hyper fixated on what the other side of the political aisle is doing and how much you disagree with them, and then you're not sure if you can trust your neighbors and your coworkers and you don't know who they voted for, and you're starting to really question your positioning within the community you live in and whether the people around you are truly in your tribe or not. That's very destabilizing for a brain. And I think that those two sensations of like truly being isolated and actually just feeling isolated or cast out in your community are both equally dangerous, I believe.
And I'm wondering the impact on the brain as it relates to kind of blending these two ideas together that it has when, the idea of being around other people is because, people challenge you to grow. You can have these intellectual conversations that challenge you and push narratives and push ideas and open yourself up to new answers to questions and stuff. And I think because we've become so tribal, we've lost that. Do you think that in order for people to maximize social connection, they should be spending time with people that challenge them, not in a negative way, but the people that are different from them, so that their brains can develop? They're not just constantly getting confirmation bias from people that agree with them on everything.
Yeah, I mean, I on a sort of personal, like non-scientific level, I do. I think that, the worst thing you can do is put yourself into an echo chamber and only hear the same perspectives over and over. And especially if those perspectives are, not based in reality and are going deeper into like just trying to hit on your desire. Of course, you're listening to media. They want you to pay attention. And so if they realize that they can get you to pay super close attention by scaring you with things that they know you're going to be afraid of, and are going to reaffirm your position against the opposing tribe, that's, they're going to take advantage of that. And that's not good for you. But I think on a more like, let me turn off my personal dispositions and talk as a neuroscientist. I think the brain actually isn't really built for that, frankly. It's not designed to let in people who we distrust. It's actually designed to do the opposite of that. It tends to, push those people out. If it recognizes that someone's different from us, your brain will treat them very differently. It'll shut off or at least reduce the activity of those empathy centers. It basically treats those people as less human. But I think what can happen and what can be really spectacular and therapeutic is when you do approach those conversations and you blend yourself with someone who you didn't typically, you wouldn't normally blend yourself with and talk with and learn about and find things in common. It can be very just pleasant for your brain, because you can imagine this, let's take it hundreds of thousands of years ago, you're at war with another tribe and you meet one of the other rival tribesmen and you realize, oh, this person's actually quite like me and maybe not a threat to me. This person's actually safe. That for your brain is such a comforting feeling. And I think that happens in tiny versions all the time. Like if you think about I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they told me that he took his daughter out, and they were, I don't know why, for some reason, standing by the road and waving to cars driving by, and the cars would beep. And he was like, it was the best feeling in the world. And I'm like, yeah, because that's your brain is feeling this comfort in like realizing that you have allies that you didn't know about. These cars passing, these members of your community, they're honking, they're showing their camaraderie with you, and your brain is rejoicing because it's like, oh, those people are on my team. And maybe before I wasn't sure, but now I know that I feel safe with them. And I think when you can cross that border with someone who it wasn't a neutral person, but someone that you did distrust, it can provide such relief. And it also is just like a good thing to do for society. So I do think we should be embracing, across whatever party lines, whatever it is. I mean, it doesn't have to be about political party. It could be about your favorite football team. I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. I think Buffalo Bills fans and New York Jets fans should get together and have parties and hang out. It would kind of defeat the purpose of the sport, but like that kind of thing is, I think, can be very good for us and for healing the perceived division that we all feel in today's society.
One of the big challenges that exists with not being lonely is rejection or being ghosted. What do those things do to the brain, and like why is it so hard for people to be rejected?
Yeah, it's the same principle. I mean, if you are in a tribe and your survival depends on the tribe and you get cast out, you're screwed. You're going to be more likely to die. And so we're horribly afraid of rejection. We all experience some level of social anxiety, and some people will say, oh, no, I don't. We all do. It's natural. It's part of the brain's desire to fit in and to not be rejected. One thing I like to point out on this is that, in specific contexts, rejection is not as likely or common as you might expect. So, like, there's some really cool research where they've taken people in real life environments, like on a train or on a bus, on a commute in public. And they have these research participants start a conversation with someone around them, which to most people might seem kind of scary. If you think about actually doing this, approaching someone on the subway and being like, hey, do you want to talk? Kind of scary, depending on your sort of social disposition. So what they found was that the participants expected that they would be just flat out rejected over half of the time. They thought more than half of the people were going to be like, off, I don't want to talk to you. Turns out nobody got rejected in the entire study. There was 0% of people on the train who said, no, thanks, I'd rather not talk. Everyone was like, sure, let's talk. And I think that's one of the sort of quiet barriers that we experience in daily life, in that, we are so afraid of rejection that we often don't take the chance to see what would happen. And, this gets even more complicated when we're talking about, not approaching a stranger on the train, but telling someone you're interested in them and asking them on a date, and of course you want to be careful and sensitive, and it's important to be cautious. But when it comes to like just generally connecting, I do think we should be more open, and maybe that's part of what is driving those divisions that we were just talking about in this, our last bit of this conversation. That maybe not only do we not want to, kind of blend with the rival team, but maybe we're afraid of being rejected by the rival team because that's what our brains would expect. But it's not always the case. We may be surprised by how much we are accepted rather than rejected.
I talk a lot about quality over quantity when it comes to friendships. What's the research say about that?
Yeah, correct, basically. I think, to some degree, quantity, there is research that quantity is good, and that interacting with a more broad and diverse group of people is better for you. So, hanging out with 10 people in 2 weeks, you get coffee with 10 different friends, versus getting coffee with the same friend 10 times. You'll probably feel better if you have interactions with a diverse group. But if half of those 10 friends are people you absolutely despise and hanging around with them makes you feel terrible, no, of course that's not good for you, and that's something I get at in the book too, is, I mentioned earlier the social diet. I think that we need to be considerate about what we're ingesting, what social experiences we are taking in. And so I suggest social journaling, basically this idea of you come home from an interaction, you take out a sheet of paper, you write a bit about who was there, where did you go, what did you talk about, and all these different factors, and trying to get at like how did you feel about the interaction and what would you change, and figuring out what parts of the interaction are good for you and what are not. And in the book I have a template for this, so you don't have to just take out a blank sheet of paper and try to figure out what to say. It's actually like questions, prompts, because I think if we can identify those, better than average interactions and fill our social diet with those, we can make sure that we're filling our cup with, a drink that we enjoy rather than, just something that we're drinking just for the hell of it.
We're both like, roughly around the same age. And I think one of the things that I had a hard time with when I was like in my early 20s was, I was a guy that was doing and selling a bunch of drugs. And the group of friends that I was spending time with, all we did is do those things, which kind of goes back to the echo chamber point, just in a different conversation. However, like a lot of people have a hard time like leaving friend groups and like going into new friends when they want to grow. Like, why is that like so challenging, even though we know that the dieting of friends, so to speak, is so good for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, it's hard to make friends, right? Like, and when you have something going and you don't want to ruin it, then, maybe, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe it's better to keep those friends around until you find something better. There's no doubt that some relationships feel different, feel better than others. And I do think we should gravitate towards the best feeling relationships. But, I'm personally fortunate that I have a very large, like long time friend group, people I went to school with growing up, that we're all still friends and we're all still close. But I've also had the experience of, making friends and kind of out of necessity, moving to a new town, a new city, and being lonely and trying to make friends and being like, I just don't know about this person. This isn't really filling my cup. And, I think leaving a friend group can be scary for the same reason that we've hit on many times now. You don't want to be cast out. It feels bad to be alone and to give away that social safety net that you have. But I think, if you are a person who has an active social life, but you don't really like any of your friends, I don't think that's a good thing. I think, especially if, it depends how much you dislike them. If you really hate these people, please don't spend your time with them. Find new friends. But, if you're not getting what you need out of your interactions, try to meet new people, see what else is out there. Because you might find that there are people who really, really fill your cup and just feel different to be around. Because once you find those people, it's the best thing ever. I'm very fortunate to have many people like that in my life.
When people come to me for advice on like how to make new friends, I kind of have my own like blueprint of like, hey, like think about like who you want to be, think about the types of activities that person would be doing, and then where would that person be doing those activities, and then go and just start talking to people, right? And I know that's probably way more simple than, it's probably way more simple than how actual life actually works. But, I found it to be somewhat effective, at least to getting people to understand, like, if you want to meet new people that you're aligned with, like, you have to actually like, think about it more than just, let me just go walk into a coffee shop. What is your like go to from like a simple scientific backed perspective on how to make connections without it being so scary?
Yeah, I actually really agree with what you said. I think a great place to start is common ground. If you can find something that you have in common, and immediately you're much more likely to be friends with this person, right? And so there's like apps like Meetup, I think, is one of them, where you can go on, like, let's say you're super into hiking, you can go on Meetup and find people going on a hike. Or, I'm not sure what else they have on there. You can probably, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of like other hobbies. You really enjoy reading, maybe you could find a book club on there. I'm not sponsored by Meetup, but if there's any way that you can find sort of community groups or community activities or resources that bring you together with people who share an interest with you, like, I think that's a great place to start. Because the fact is, if you're, like I said, you can establish conversations on trains or buses or whatever. You can have a good conversation. You can leave feeling better and boosting your mood. But the likelihood of at the end of that conversation you being like, "Hey, can I get your phone number so we can hang out sometime?" You know, it might work, it might not work, but the likelihood of you even having the courage to say that is also super low, and that's a big like expectation to put on yourself. So I think if you can lower that by just finding lower that expectation, lower the cognitive and energy demand, you're helping yourself. You're doing yourself a favor. And so I think those like public meetup groups are a really great place to start. And the fact is, everyone else going to these meetups is doing so for the exact same reason, because they're probably looking for friends. So, and you'll not only just meet one person, you'll meet a handful of people. So I really think that's a great way to do it. By the way, also, not also sponsored by Bumble, but you know, the dating app Bumble, which I think is unique in that the woman has to message first. I think that's the unique thing about it. So once you match, the guy's not allowed to say anything until she initiates. They have another sort of version of that called Bumble BFF, where you can basically just find friends. It's completely platonic. Again, not sponsored, but candidly, it's a little bit embarrassing. But I have used this to make friends, and they're actually like really good friends. Like I've gone on, you know, I like to call these dates. They pretty much are dates. You meet them on Bumble BFF, and then you go like hang out with another dude, and you know, there's a lot of vulnerability associated with it. I've gone on a couple of those where I was like, this, you know, definitely not going to see this person again. And I've gone on a few of those where I've, you know, like I said, made lifelong friends that live in various cities now, and, you know, we stay in touch. So there are resources for this. And I very strongly encourage anybody out there to start with these. You know, if you're going to use an app to find friends, do it this way where you meet up in person versus you know, resorting to some sort of online community, or like especially some sort of like AI friendship service thing where you're actually just communicating with an AI system. Please start with the in-person stuff, or prioritize the in-person stuff. It's really important.
For sure. And I would imagine people also have to kind of be careful with the Bumble BFF, because I'm sure there's people on there that are creeps and are using that to, like, you know, say they're in there for platonic reasons, but really they want something else, right? So I guess people have to also be mindful. I mean, you're somebody that does an immense amount of research in everything that you do. What's been the most like shocking thing you found between the social connection in the brain?
Okay, so it's going to be a big diversion from what we've been talking about so far, but it's so cool. So in the book, I have a chapter on parent-child bonds and like romantic love. Basically, the core thing that brings these relationships together is like deep connection, and talking about why these bonds are so important. I'm going to give you two. Number one, people who are married are significantly more likely to survive cancer, and in some cases, research actually shows that being married is a stronger predictor of survival from cancer than getting chemotherapy. Mind blowing. And by the way, part of that is because it's kind of, they're linked together. Married people are more likely to get more treatment because they have like more support, more people, you know, more to live for, basically, more to fight for. So it's not totally separate, but like mind blowing. And there's a lot of reasons why having these deep relationships is so important. But the other thing, and this is like I said, a diversion. So I talk about parent-child bonds, and everybody knows that oxytocin helps parents bond with their children. Or maybe everybody's heard that. Not everybody knows that, but you know, you've all heard it's the love hormone. You love your child so much because of oxytocin. So when mothers are about to give birth, they show these bursts of oxytocin that get longer. The burst lasts longer, and they come more frequently as the birth approaches. And so when I first read that, I thought, okay, you know, this is probably because it's, you know, the mother's body is getting ready to meet the baby and to fall in love with the baby. But it turns out there's evidence that this oxytocin in the mother goes into the baby and changes the way that the brain cells are functioning, so that they basically, the brain cells become less active overall. And what that does is, with brain cells being less active, they need less glucose, they need less oxygen. It lowers their metabolic needs. And the reason for that is because when the baby is being forced through the canal into the world, there's a very high chance that the baby's going to experience periods of oxygen deprivation, that it'll be, you know, whatever, the umbilical cord may be compressed, or they may be, for whatever reason, you know, as they're passing through the tight area, they may not be able to breathe and get as much oxygen delivered to them, or not breathe at all because they're not breathing yet, but get more oxygen delivered. And so that shift from the mother's oxytocin protects the baby's brain. It's neuroprotective because they can better survive periods of oxygen deprivation because their cells aren't as active. And so to me, that was like the most unbelievable thing I learned. I never knew that. And it's so awesome because it shows just how brilliant biology is, and that we have these systems built into us that we don't even really know about, we don't even really think about. But before a mother even meets their newborn, they have already protected their brain without even thinking about it, and using the same chemical, not to mention, that will allow them to also form a bond with that newborn. And I just think that is so amazing. And there's a lot of stuff like that throughout the book where like some things I already knew, some things I learned while researching the book, but there's some wild stuff out there on social connection.
That is wild. It's super crazy stuff, and thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, I bet you it had to be like, so what's been more meaningful for you, like the research you've done on this, or like the research you've done on other things in your past?
I would say this because I mean, I've led a bunch of projects. I've published over 20 peer reviewed papers as a scientist, but they're all very mechanistic, like molecular, and it's all looking at like deep molecular stuff in animal models of like what's really going on in the brain and what brain systems guide social interaction, but none of it's actually in humans. And I think to take all that information that I had already understood about neuroscience and then step out and do a bunch of research, reading hundreds, thousands, honestly thousands of papers from this field, from human research, from all different countries, and doing my best to take all that information and compress it into a version that anybody can read and understand was just an amazing journey and very gratifying, because at the end I got to this point where the book has like 400 references, to scientific papers. It originally had like 500, but I had to take some out. But luckily, that stuff is in the bonus chapter. But I mean, I read like thousands of papers, and to have that all compressed into a handheld book that anybody can read and understand, I'm really proud of that, because science for way too long has been very disconnected from society. It's hard to access. You have to pay for paywalls, or you have to pay to get through paywalls. You have to read through unintelligible jargon, and the very first page of my book is a no big words clause, where I basically say there's enough barriers keeping people out of science. In this book, I promise I will not use any big words unnecessarily. And if I do, there's an appendix where you can read a definition and more context about that. And that only happened because I absolutely had to. There was no other term I could use. So, I really, I take that mission seriously. I want people to be able to read and understand science.
I love that, man. When people are in the context of connection, I think one of the biggest things that also prevents people from having lifelong connections is their ability to repair like relationships, like say they're sorry and forgive. What's the science on all that, and what's your perspective?
I mean, I talk in the book about, like I said, the importance of those special connections. I mean, for instance, like parent-child relationships, romantic relationships, those two bonds are kind of unparalleled. Like even like your best friends don't produce the same sort of brain effects as those types of relationships. And like you said, I mean, sometimes those bonds can be broken. And I talk in the book about like why we should not let that happen, why we should repair those bonds. I think it's really context dependent. I hate being the guy, it's overly self-helpy to say, I know you hate your mom, but go hang out with her, right? Like, no, let's be realistic here. If there's a real issue separating the two of you, it's worth attempting to repair, but it's not necessarily, something you need to do. It's all about, you have to protect yourself, right? You have to build your social diet. And if that's not a meaningful component or ingredient of your social diet, it's not worth it. But, I mean, like I said, without people who are single, who do not have, who are not married, are literally more likely to die from cancer. And I think that just shows the importance of social connection and supporting our health and preventing us from falling prey to challenging times. When we're stressed, and our health is declining, we have people there with us to support us. That means a lot. I'm a fan of forgiveness for sure. I think I am even sometimes criticized by people in my life for being overly forgiving and for giving people the benefit of the doubt too much. I just think that division is too stressful for me personally. And as long as I get basically some sense of accountability and forgiveness and responsibility from them, um, I'm moving on because I know that it's going to be better for me in the long run. And, and if there's not in a sense of accountability and respect, then, then that relationship will no longer exist. And I think that's just kind of how I live my life. But I do want to say that that's guided by my neuroscience background.
Forgiveness is powerful, man. It truly is. And I think it's harder to forgive yourself sometimes, because of our own like egos and self-esteem stuff and confidence issues, but it's so important. One of the other things, I like talking about like how we can get through the challenges that people come up against when it comes to certain ideas. And when we're talking about loneliness, I think one of the things is people will often say, well, I'm just an introvert and I don't need to go out and be around people. And you hear stories of people like literally training themselves by going up and, setting a goal to like talk to 5 new people a day, or they do like um, improv, like comedy, and that gets them like to open up more. Is there science that shows that you could actually like train your brain to go from being like an introvert to an extrovert?
Such a good question. So I don't think so. I mean, there's probably some flexibility, but I think most of the time, or generally, that's like a fixed trait. Um, but like, and sorry, let me back up here too. Those who are more introverted, generally, the way I see it, uh, they need less interaction to be happy. They are not as enthused by interaction, and basically, these are people who their cup overflows very easily. Now, I think by being deliberate about shaping your social interactions and thinking about your social diet, I think that what introverts can do is basically change the how quickly their cup overfills. If you can configure interactions that are meaningful and not overwhelming and draining to you, then you can fill your cup without going overboard and suffering the consequences of over socialization. So I applaud those people who are working to get out there and to socialize. It's something I struggle to relate to and understand because I am born an extrovert, and we are generally shaped by our genetics and our early life experiences as for what we are, what our social disposition is. But yeah, I mean, if for those people who are very introverted, you will probably never be a social butterfly and extrovert. But if you give yourself the right circumstances and you interact with the right people and you put yourself in those situations in the right times and settings, I think that you can feel like an extrovert and enjoy and reap the benefits of social interaction without feeling overwhelmed. And it's important to identify that, because if you're just throwing yourself into an uncomfortable situation and saying, I'm challenging myself to do this, and you feel horrible, like that's not helping you. That's not helping anybody. So work on maybe finding those things. Like, what is it about this interaction or that interaction that makes you feel good and comfortable, and try to build that in wherever you can. And the social journaling is a great idea for figuring those things out too.
What's interesting, you brought up there's no, well, like a science to go from introvert to extrovert. I look at it like maybe from a more holistic perspective, which I know holistic and science don't always necessarily go together, but and this is purely anecdotal. I know that when I was younger, I walked a lot with my head down, shoulders rounded, wasn't necessarily the most extroverted. I mean, I liked being around people, but I wouldn't have considered myself extroverted. It was more like I was just addicted to being around people because that I thought that would help my self-esteem. But then as I got more fit, I worked on myself, I became more confident. I enjoyed talking to people more because there wasn't this like fear of rejection because of the way I felt about myself anymore. So I'm wondering if, and again, maybe there's no science to back this up, but just as a byproduct of people taking care of themselves, it'll actually make you more um, less socially awkward because it's like working on those things indirectly where you don't have to go out and like be like, all right, I'm going to go introduce myself to 5 people. That's you're good. You're good. You're good. Where you don't necessarily have to go introduce yourself to 5 people. You're like, okay, I can just like work out and focus on like building my life and improving my self-esteem. And then as a byproduct of that, I'm going to naturally be less socially awkward because I feel better about myself. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I can also relate to that. I went through a similar journey, social journey, but it was earlier in life. It kind of happened to me around like adolescence. So, it may have been just sort of part of the shaping of my brain. But I think what you're getting at and what you're revealing is that our social habits are very, they can be heavily influenced by a lot of different variables, a lot of different factors, and some of that, like it could be your confidence, it could be who you're interacting with, yeah, how you feel about yourself. It could be the meal you ate. If you had pizza and you have acid reflux and you're in a social environment and you feel like you're probably not going to be very outgoing, you're probably going to be more reserved. And so I think, I actually think sort of what you're describing is a distinct feature from extroversion, because extroversion is more just like about like how much you joy and energy and how much you enjoy socializing, whereas what you're describing is more of like what's your relationship to the world, and having confidence, I think, is probably one of the more major factors in determining how we meet the world and how we engage with others. And also, not to mention, when you're more confident, you probably have better interactions, which probably makes you feel more likely to go and have another interaction afterwards, So I think these things are very much intertwined.
Right. And I think that's why like you'll hear a lot of people say that like the catalyst for self transformation is fitness. And I don't think it's because you have to bench like 315 or you have to like go like be able to run a mile in under 5 minutes. It's more like when you're exercising, you're essentially just telling yourself you care. And you're like, you know what? Like I care about myself enough to get up off the couch and move my body for a little bit instead of like reaching for the drugs or the alcohol or the cigarettes or whatever. And then you build off of that. And then you're showing yourself like incremental progress in life, which again, just correlates just to how you might view other things. So I just think a lot of these things we're talking about, I mean, some are direct and then others are very indirect. But I think when people say, oh, you got to work out, like they think, oh, I have to go to the gym for 3 hours. It's like, no, like just you got to move your body a little bit more today than you did yesterday or the week before, and just kind of show your brain that you have compassion for who you are and you're doing it because you care about your long-term health.
Yeah, I've always said, not on social media or whatever, but like in my life, there is nobody more confident than a guy who just started working out. Like when you get that first boost of like you haven't worked out in a while and then you go to the gym like 3 times in a week, you're so confident because you just feel so dramatically transformed. And I think the other thing to recognize here is like it's a cascade, right? Because you go to the gym and then you come home and you're hungry. You're much less likely to get Burger King. You're probably going to say, oh, you know what? I don't want to ruin my workout. Let me have a salad. So then you have a salad. So then you feel a little better and you're like, you know what? I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I think I want to go on a date. And then you go on the date and the person reacts differently to you because you're bringing a totally different energy. And then you're like, wow, that date went great. I feel good about myself. I want to work out right now because I feel so energized, and it's just this whole cascade that triggers all these different changes in your life. And I mean, I do exercise. I have exercised for decades, and I find that I'm very cyclical. I will get into a rhythm of working out regularly, and then I'll fall out of it, and then I'll get back into it. And the way I feel about life and just my overall mood is dramatically different in those periods where I am working out. I feel so much better and just so much more confident and so much more capable too. I think that's the other thing. Like people who haven't tried working out before, what they don't realize is like it's not just about like you're looking in the mirror and you feel good or your weight goes down. It's like you actually experience benefits in real life. Like you're going up the stairs or you're carrying your groceries and you feel more capable. And that's really empowering too. And I think that can kind of diffuse into your mood and your self-confidence in a way that just makes you feel more ready and engaged to meet the world. So it's one of the best things you could possibly do. And also it's just good for your brain, not to mention.
Well, and within the context of this conversation, like meeting new people, like making new friends, like the gym is the ultimate place because despite what you might believe, like 99.9% of the people in the gym are really like cool and there to better themselves, and they're focused on goals and they're there to help you. No one's like judging, what you're doing, unless you're a jerk to them or something. But, I think that's a great place to meet new people who are like, and especially if you take like a workout class. I've always told people like, hey, go take an exercise class. Cause now it's not like the awkward, like you're talking to somebody in between a set. Now it's like people already know if you're taking a class, you're doing it because you kind of like to work out in a social setting. And you can say hi to people there. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I can't emphasize enough like with what you just said, like, and especially like when you start as a guy, you start seeing like, the veins, get some vascularity. You're like, oh my God, like this stops working, and there's no better feeling in the world.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, aside from workout classes too, like workout buddy, having a person that you go to the gym with, that's so nice. I've been in and out of that my whole life too, and I love working out with a partner. It's motivating. You're socializing because you're not sitting there in between sets just like huffing and puffing, right? You're probably having a conversation, so you're getting a social interaction in there too. Yeah, I mean, the gym can be a very great social environment.
Agreed. Well, Ben, this has been an awesome combo. Great dialogue here, and I think the audience can get a lot of value out of it. Where can people get the book if they want to buy it?
Yeah, so it's out October 14th. It's called Why Brains Need Friends. And you can get it anywhere. So if it's before October 14th today when you're listening to this, then you could pre-order it anywhere, Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, books.com, Target, whatever. And if it's after October 14th today, you can buy it and have it immediately at any of those same places or local bookstores you could check. But yeah, and if you're interested in any of the my papers, my research, or you want to contact me directly, my website is just my name, Ben Rein, REIN.com. So BENREIN.com. So, but yeah, thank you so much for having me, Doug. This has been fun, and it's been probably good for our brains too.
It has. I'm ready to go work out now. So thank you.
Yeah, good. Of
All right, man. Well, thank you again for coming back on the pod.
course. Thanks for having me.